left side of her face is colored like yellow or orange, and hard to tell whether that's just a characteristic of her people, or if maybe she was injured in battle, or if it's some sort of marking. But later on, that look disappears, and her hairstyle changes to more full head of hair, but short, closely cropped. And so all three of them are trying to figure out what happened to Miden. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. And they're also wondering why the three of them are the only ones to survive this disappearance, which presumably came about at the behest or magic of an evil wizard whose identity is not known to them. So they're traveling through the nearby land, trying to get a sense of what exactly has happened when they meet two other individuals who will become their companions. We meet Sir Brant, and he is a human male, a literal knight in shining armor, very tall, confident, courageous, natural leader. He has one really prominent mustache on him, and even though he's not from the village of Miden, he has vowed that he will help his new friends find the evil wizard who has taken their village. And there's also a personal aspect for him on this journey. He was in the nearby vicinity when the village just flashed out of existence, and this flashing out actually resulted in Sir Brant being blinded. And so now he has to rely on his new companions to help be his eyes. That's his major, I guess you could say, Achilles' heel throughout this issue, is that even though he is a strong, excellent warrior, he really relies on his eyesight, and so it's difficult for him in the early going to adjust to this physical disability. Sir Brant has been helped initially by Sandinar, who's this older, innocent-looking dwarf, and not only has he been helping Sir Brant after being blinded, but he's willing to help Fen and Ryan and Elodil also find Miden and find the wizard who took the village from them. And so over the course of this story, all five go on a journey throughout the world of Beyond. The mission is twofold. One, they want to find the wizard who took the village, but at the same time they also have to find out which wizard it was exactly who made their village disappear. And so that takes them through different forests and enchanted lands, where they come up against ogres, they come up against the pygmies, they're literal pigmen with sharp fangs. They also come up against snail men. They get broken up at different points. Brant and Elodil get separated from the from Sandinar and from Fen and from Ryan, and so there's a couple of little quests going on before they all meet up again at another point. You get some great sword fights throughout this. It's also a tale of deception and betrayal, and it's really neat how near the end of this first arc we see that our five heroes are progressing in their journey. They're on their way to find a mystical artifact which will help them take down the evil wizard who they are looking for. But the way this ends, you can really see that Mr. Cumley Freeman, at least, plan on continuing this story, taking it in another direction, while still sticking to the main quest of finding the village. But there's more that could be told. Certainly plenty of room for future character development, looking at the relationships between the members of the group. I have to say, I'm not really a fan of sword and sorcery tales. Growing up, like a lot of kids, I was really interested in King Arthur and the stories of the Knights of the Round Table, and I did enjoy Camelot 3000 from DC Comics immensely, but outside of that, I'm really more of a superheroes in the present day, or in World War II time. Those are my interests there. A story like Beyond, normally I probably overlook it. But I'm really appreciative to the folks who are working at the Chapter House booth there 2 years ago who threw this in with my purchase. I ended up really enjoying this story. I mean, one, it was for nostalgia. I mean, this is a story which came out in the late 70s and early 80s. It's by three excellent comics creators. Of course, Richard Cumley being the co-creator of Captain Canuck. And I've talked at length about his career working with Captain Canuck. But Claude Saint-Aubin and George Freeman, they've gone on to really wonderful careers in comics of their own, having worked for DC and I want to say Marvel as well. Mr. Saint-Aubin, I've seen his artwork pop up in any number of so-called mainstream issues that I've read over the years. Of course, Mr. Freeman, whose pencil work has only grown and grown over the decades, would also go on to become one of the founders of Digital Chameleon, the company that produced inking and coloring services for DC and Marvel in the 90s and probably the early 2000s, including the John Ostrander, Tom Mandrake run of the Spectre. So that popped into my head as I was recently reading Ostrander Mandrake's Spectre run in preparation for a future Spectre Spotlight episode. But it's really neat to see these three men looking at the work they produced when they were young and still making their names in comics. It's really interesting to see how the art evolves over the course of these issues. Sorry about that, folks. Occupational hazard when you're recording a podcast on your phone. You can get interrupted by a phone call when you least expect it. But moving back to this, in terms of Claude Saint-Aubin's artwork, I've always been a bigger fan of George Freeman's art and Richard Cumley's art too. But Jean-Claude Saint-Aubin here shows a lot of youthful energy in these initial chapters of Beyond. And then you can just see over the course of the series how he's already grown as an artist. And the look of the characters becomes more consistent. There's a lot of detail in each panel, a lot of movement, and some really nice writing from the crew, and that you can really tell just how invested they were in the series, that there's never any point where it feels like the writing is dominating over the artwork and vice versa. You can see certain pages when they know it's better to let the art do the storytelling. And then there's just some really nice dialogue and some really nice text passages too in this. Something which really stands out is the amount of color which you see throughout this story. And not surprising, given that one of the three men who was working on the series would go on to be the founder of a major company like Digital Chameleon. Another plus to reading Beyond and Collected Edition is that the art has been remastered. Well, with the exception of the final chapter, which was produced sometime in 2014, 2015. But when you look at the artwork that originally appeared in chapters 9, 10, and 11, it really pops here, the color. And they were using a pretty revolutionary coloring method at the time. And going back to the foreword, Mr. Comley explains that after the line art was completed, a sheet of clear acetate was positioned over the art and vinyl acrylic copolymer paint. The same paint used in painting animation cells was brushed on. That gave us much more latitude with color and tone. End quote. That sounds like a pretty complex process. But in the end, it just looks really great. And Mr. Comley also points out in the foreword, just as an advance warning to readers, that the fourth chapter, which corresponds to the story that was presenting Captain Canuck number 12, looks different. And that's because the Library Archives of Canada does not have the original art for the Beyond installment for Captain Canuck number 12. So when it came to reprinting that chapter here in the collected edition, I guess folks at Chapter House had to scan in the printed pages from an issue that was originally in circulation and then do whatever they could there. So by comparison, the art seems a bit more muted, a bit more faded, just because they haven't been able to use the same restoration techniques that they were able to use working off the original art for the previous chapters. But even still, you can see that when this art was originally produced, it was, I'd say, ahead of its time in terms of the color work. And that's interesting to take a look at the color work here and Beyond, and then compare it to works done by Digital Chameleon, such as the Spectre, and you can really see a connection there. Looking at what Freeman and Saint-Aubin were doing back in the late 70s and early 80s. Story-wise, what I really like is that this is a quest story which involves not one but a whole group of different individuals, and it's really neat to see them come together, see them develop a feeling of camaraderie, even though two of them would on a normal day be considered outsiders. They almost approach something like a family. Actually very much like Star Wars in that way, in which you may have a favorite character, but at the same time you're enjoying the story because you're seeing the whole group and you're seeing all these personalities and how they may have their disagreements with each other, but they do care for each other. Really nice stuff. Also, what I really appreciate is that when you get to this final chapter by Mr. Freeman and Comley, even though it's a chapter that's been released for the better part 30 years after the previous chapter was produced